for a while what I'm supposed to talk about this Yom Kippur morning. It's been weighing on me for a long time. Before the sisterhood approached me about the topic, before I was back from leave, I knew it before the President of the United States issued an executive order that effectively prohibits federal contractors and grantees from engaging in many forms of diversity, inclusion, and implicit bias trainings. I knew it before the words Black Lives Matter were emblazoned in 35-foot tall yellow letters across 16th Street. I knew it before I took a not even 8-week-old baby with the tiniest protest sign to trail distantly behind a march on Connecticut Avenue as people chanted, "Say their names." I knew this was the sermon I was supposed to give when I watched live on television the president stand in front of St. John's Episcopal Church with a Bible in hand after law enforcement officers cleared protesters from Lafayette Square using tear gas or not tear gas or pepper spray or who knows what. That was on June 1st. But I should have known that this was the sermon to give before May 25th, when George Floyd died after a police officer knelt on his neck for 8 minutes, 46 seconds. And before March 13th, when police entered a home with a no-knock search warrant and fatally shot Breonna Taylor. And before February 23rd, when 2 white men followed and gunned down Ahmaud Arbery when he was out for a jog near his home. And before and before and before, let's be honest, this sermon should have been given long ago. It should have been given even when the Movement for Black Lives platform still included pro-BDS and anti-Israel statements, which have since been removed. It should have been given before because Black Lives Matter, full stop. Maybe I can justify not addressing this issue sooner because in our community, we believe that every life is sacred. We believe that people are created b'tselem Elohim, in the image of God. We believe that the lives of Black and Brown and Native people matter. But I must address this issue on Yom Kippur, the holiest day on our calendar, because Black lives matter. And we as a Jewish community have not done enough to state this unequivocally. Most of us who are white members of this congregation haven't done enough to engage in the difficult work of anti-racism. We haven't done enough for our Black and Brown members and for the Black and Brown people who make up our larger communities. This issue pervaded the soul of our community long before the pandemic began, and the wound will not even begin to scar over by the time we are able to join together again within the walls of our synagogue. As a sacred community, we are late to this conversation. But if we are better late than never, then now is the time. In a few moments, we will read from our Torah, Atem nitzavim hayom kulchem lifnei Adonai Elohechem. You stand here this day, all of you, in the presence of Adonai, your God, your tribal heads, your elders and officials, all the men of Israel, your children, your women, and the stranger within your camp, from the one who cuts your wood to the one who draws your water, to enter into the covenant of Adonai, your God. I often read this text as an example of inclusivity. Everyone stood to enter the covenant. Everyone, every gender, every profession. But was it actually that inclusive? If every word in the Torah is intentional, then we cannot ignore the order in which the recipients of the covenant are listed. The elders and officials are listed first. Medieval commentator Rashi suggested that this is because the more prominent stood in the front. Behind them stood the men of Israel. Behind the men were the children, then the women, then the stranger, and only then the woodcutters and water drawers. Yes, everyone stood to enter the covenant, but not everyone got to enter it equally. Some got access to the entrance more readily and easily than others. We want to read this text and say all lives matter. But if some got to stand closer based solely on specific demographic characteristics, then not all of those lives mattered equally. Some mattered more than others. And if some mattered more than others, then we can't say all lives mattered. Male officials and elders mattered, and perhaps If there was enough to go around, everyone else standing there could partake. But when limited resources exist in this type of system, not everyone still matters. That's why all lives can't matter until Black lives matter. I am a Jewish woman with a heck of a lot of white privilege. We are a congregation with many individuals who are afforded white privilege. We are a congregation that strives for justice at every step, a congregation filled with care and concern and good intentions, a congregation guided by Torah, guided by the command, tzedek, tzedek, tirdof, justice, justice, you shall pursue, where everyone who comes into our building matters, in theory, but not in practice. Because until we all matter the same, we can't claim that we all matter. Most of us need to do some serious cheshbon hanefesh, serious soul searching, looking at ourselves, noting where we failed people of color, including those in our own Temple Shalom community. Al chet shechatanu lefanecha. For the sin we have committed before you by wondering, how did you become Jewish? When looking at the Black and brown faces of our children and adult members. For the sin we have committed before you by assuming our members of color are kitchen staff. For the sin we have committed before you by not bringing in more Jews of color to offer sermons, lead services, and teach. Not to teach about what it means to be a Jew of color, but to offer sermons, to lead services, and to teach, period. For the sin we have committed before you by creating a system where all of our highest paid staff members are white and most of our lowest paid staff members are people of color. For the sin we have committed before you by not having more members of color serving in leadership roles. For the sin we have committed before you by creating a system where our young adults of color need to carefully calculate whether they will share that they are Jewish once they go to college, because it's yet another thing to have to deal with. For the sin we have committed before you by not having more frank conversations about race. For the sin we have committed before you by diminishing the multitude of your creation by saying we are colorblind or don't see color. For the sin we have committed before you by assuming a police presence provides safety to all of our members when it can actually threaten the safety of people of color in our community. For the sin we have committed before you by patting ourselves on the back for the Jewish community's involvement in the civil rights movement in the 60s, while not talking about the ways the Jewish community perpetuates racism and benefits from racist systems today. For the sin we have committed before you by expressing frustration when movies and books about the voting rights movement don't illustrate Jewish involvement. For the sin we have committed before you by turning our Black and brown members to our Black and brown members and assuming that they want to be the voice of lived Black and brown experiences. Al chet shechatanu lefanecha, for the sin we have committed before you by trying to explain away the stories of Black and brown people's experiences in the Jewish community instead of internalizing their reality and pain endured. Ve'al kulam eloas lichot, for all these failures of judgment and will, God of forgiveness, don't forgive us or pardon us until we've repaired these transgressions. We stand here today, all of us, as a Temple Shalom community made up of people of different stature and gender and orientation and color and size and age. And if we are going to be honest with ourselves, we must admit that even within the walls of our own congregation, we have created systems where some of us matter more than others. Most of us are exhausted. For many of us, the exhaustion will at least begin to subside when the pandemic does. But the exhaustion of many people of color in our synagogue and in our larger community will not end with the pandemic. Many people of color are tired of talking about racism with white people. It is depleting. As the senior rabbi and as a white Jew in this community, I'm turning to the people of color and parents, loved ones, and relatives of people of color in our community right now to say, I am sorry for the pain I have caused you. I have done and said racist things without even realizing. I am in deepest awe of and have the most profound gratitude to those of you who have found yourselves in the unfair and uncomfortable position of confronting me, your rabbi, about these transgressions. But because you do that, I can do teshuvah. I can work to grow and change and live and lead more justly. I have failed you. We as a community have failed you. And I know that I'm sorry is not enough for me to utter, because on Yom Kippur, I must resolve to do better. We must resolve to do better. I commit to you that I am standing here today striving for better. I am committing to be more intentional about who teaches in our community, to have open and honest conversations about race, to doing my part in addressing systemic racism, to working toward becoming an anti-racist congregation. I commit to digging deep to find and then admit to the ugliest parts of who we are, of who I am. I'm embarrassed to say I haven't yet read White Fragility. I've only started to read How to Be an Anti-Racist. I've only started Between the World and Me. I've only listened to the first 2 episodes of Nice White Parents. There's so much to do, and it's so hard to know where to begin. So how can we get started? We can read and listen and talk and reflect. We can take to heart the shortcomings brought to our own attention and do the difficult and essential work to improve on them. Rabbi Susan Taub and Sarah Barish Hagan suggest rules of engagement for white Jews. Among those rules are the following: explode the myth that all Jews are white. When we really mean white Jews, say that. Figure out what our community has to do to make a truly welcoming space for Jews of color, and do it. Know the disparities in our community and commit to learning more about their root causes. Find out what our community does to hire minorities and people coming out of prison. Expect that our synagogue pays all of its workers a living wage. Examine our synagogue's relationship to or reliance on the police and how it may make certain people feel welcome or unwelcome in our community. Identify legislative opportunities to reduce racial profiling, the school to state prison pipeline, and mass incarceration in our city, county, and state. I name all of these not because we can do them all immediately, but because we must start to do them now. We must not expect Black and brown members of our community to lead our tough conversations. This is on those of us who are white Jews and white members of our Jewish community. And today we start Temple Shalom's conversation. At 1 p.m., everyone, regardless of age or background, is encouraged to attend your role as a member of the Jewish community in addressing systemic racism, where members Rachel Bremen and John Landisman will help us explore what systemic racism is, how it impacts our communities, and how to be anti-racist. During our Ella Ezkara section at the beginning of Yizkor, we will also be remembering some of those in our community, of our country, people of color who died over this past year or who were killed. If we want to be able to say, Atem nitzavim hayom kulchem, you are standing here today, all of you, then first we need to acknowledge who has been afforded the opportunity to stand closest to the front and who has been left standing further away in our own congregation and communities. Only when we create a system where everyone truly has the opportunity to be in front will everyone be able to stand here today and truly matter. Not until Black lives matter can all lives matter, and we're not there yet. May we be sealed for a better year, a safer year, a healthier year, and a more just year.